Before the lights, before the knockouts, before the UFC was a billion-dollar empire, there was one man who carried it on his back. Chuck Liddell, the Iceman, the mohawk, the stare, the right hand that could shut out consciousness in a single blink. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a force, the first true superstar of MMA. But legends don't rise without scars, and Chuck's fall was as brutal as his rise was electric. Knockouts turned into questions, glory turned into memory loss. The cage gave him fame, but it didn't give him peace. This is the story of the man who brought MMA to the mainstream and paid for it with his body, his mind, and maybe his future. Because in the end, Chuck Liddell didn't just fight opponents. He fought time itself. Before we start, subscribe the channel to support our growth. Thank you. Before Chuck Liddell became the face of a blood sport, he was just another quiet kid growing up in Santa Barbara, California. But quiet didn't mean calm. Not in Chuck's case. Raised primarily by his single mother and grandparents, Chuck's life was far from easy. His father walked out early. The family scraped by. And underneath his calm exterior, there was a storm building, a pressure that needed a release. That release came in the form of fists. As a teenager, Chuck was no stranger to street fights, but this wasn't recklessness. This was instinct, controlled rage. He didn't fight for fun. He fought because it felt like the only language he was fluent in. The bars of Isla Vista, Santa Barbara's college party district, became an unofficial testing ground for his toughness. Local legends still talk about how many guys he dropped outside the clubs. No gloves, no rules, just fists, instinct, and ice in his veins. But Chuck wasn't some mindless thug. He was smart, methodical, and he had discipline when it mattered. He found it first in karate, then kickboxing, and eventually wrestling. By high school, he was already training seriously. And it paid off. He went on to wrestle at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where he earned a degree in accounting. Yes, accounting, while lifting weights, training, and still fighting behind the scenes. It was during this time that Chuck walked into a small, gritty gym called The Pit, run by the eccentric and intense John Hackleman. That gym would become sacred ground. It was where the brawler was forged into a warrior. Hackleman saw something in Chuck that others missed, an unteachable sense of timing and a total lack of fear. Together, they stripped away the sloppiness and built a killer, a patient, brutal, calculated machine. In 1998, Chuck fought his first pro MMA bout at UFC 17. He didn't just win, he imposed. The guy didn't smile, didn't posture, just walked in with a shaved head, tattoos, and that frozen, dead-eyed glare. He was all business, and the fans? They didn't know what to make of him yet. The UFC wasn't a household name in the late 90s. It was barely legal in most states. The crowds were small, the pay was smaller. But Chuck didn't care about any of that. He was there to fight. That was it. No theatrics, no catchphrases, just violence. Over the next few years, he quietly started stacking wins. Jeremy Horn, Kevin Randleman, Jeff Monson. He even faced a young Vitor Belfort and beat him. Chuck wasn't just a puncher, he was a tactician. He sprawled better than anyone in the division, had devastating leg kicks, and when he threw that looping right hand, lights out. But even with those wins, Chuck wasn't famous. Not yet, not even close. He was a hammer in a toolbox no one had opened yet. That was about to change. Because around the corner, there was another rising star, a former friend turned rival, a flashy, polarizing figure who would become the perfect foil to Chuck's cold-blooded style. His name, Tito Ortiz. And together, they would change MMA forever. When Chuck Liddell entered the UFC in 1998, MMA wasn't even called MMA yet. They called it No Holds Barred, human cockfighting, a barbaric underground blood sport held in half-empty arenas with bad lighting and no guarantees. There were no massive TV deals, no Reebok sponsors, no ESPN coverage. The fighters got paid peanuts, if they got paid at all. The cage wasn't a stage for superstars, it was a proving ground for the insane, but Chuck didn't care. He wasn't in it for fame, he was in it for the fight. After a few quiet wins in the UFC, he started turning heads. His striking was violent, yes, but it was the control that scared people. Most guys in the cage fought like wild animals. Chuck fought like a sniper, calm, measured, calculated. He'd absorb a punch just to land his own. And when it landed, men folded, faces twisted, bodies dropped. While most fighters were struggling to make ends meet, Chuck had a backup plan. A degree in accounting. He could have walked away, sat in a cubicle, made decent money. But the idea of office life made him sick, so he kept fighting. Behind the scenes, teens, he was training with John Hackleman at the Pit, a no-frills gym where egos got checked and warriors got built. They trained in a garage, hit tires with sledgehammers, and sparred without headgear. Hackleman didn't babysit Chuck. He unleashed him. Between 1999 and 2002, Chuck took fights that made no sense. He went to Pride in Japan, fought in front of tens of thousands, and took on guys like Guy Mezger and Murillo Bustamante. He didn't win them all, but he never backed down. He wasn't building a brand. He was building a resume. Then came the light heavyweight tournament in 2003. Chuck was the odds-on favorite to win it all. His opponent in the semifinals? A young, vicious Brazilian named Rampage Jackson. Chuck went in confident, but Rampage didn't fold. He punished Chuck with body shots and elbows, and for the first time, the Iceman melted. TKO loss. It was a setback, but it lit a fire. The UFC at the time was struggling. Still banned in many states, still bankrupt. They needed stars, not just good fighters, personalities, flash, drama, rivalries. Enter Tito Ortiz. Chuck and Tito had trained together, sparred, even roomed together. But as Chuck kept winning and Tito held the belt, tension grew. Tito refused to fight Chuck, said they were friends. Chuck called it what it was, fear. The UFC saw gold. They stoked the fire. Dana White pushed the narrative. The cold killer versus the cocky playboy. Mohawk versus sunglasses. Silence versus smack talk. It worked. By the time they finally signed to fight, the UFC had something it never had before: hype. By 2004, Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz weren't just two elite fighters, they were rivals, written in fire. Tito had the belt, the press, and the showmanship. Chuck had the knockouts and the cold, calculating presence that terrified opponents. Their feud wasn't manufactured, it was real. Tito ducked the fight for years, claiming friendship. Chuck called it cowardice. And Dana White? He knew the drama was money in the bank. UFC 47 was the boiling point. Chuck versus Tito. The grudge match fans had been dying for. The hype was unreal. The way in was pure chaos. Tito jawed, smirked, tried to play alpha. Chuck didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just stared. The stare of a man who had already seen the fight in his mind 1,000 times. On April 2nd, 2004, they stepped into the cage. Tito danced around. Chuck stalked. First round, tense. Second round, over. Chuck landed a looping right hand, and Tito collapsed. The ref waved it off. Chuck didn't celebrate wildly. He just stood there, expressionless. A hitman with the job done. It wasn't just a win, it was a statement. Chuck Liddell wasn't just coming for the title, he was coming for the throne. The fight sold more pay-per-views than any event in UFC history to that point. And for the first time, casual sports fans knew Chuck Liddell's name. He was booked on talk shows, featured in commercials, even movie cameos. Hollywood was calling, and Chuck wasn't calling back. He kept training, kept winning. He wasn't in love with fame. He was in love with the fight. Still, the UFC saw their golden goose. Dana White, once his manager, now his promoter, began building the brand of the Iceman. That mohawk, the blue flames on his shorts, that stoic glare. Chuck wasn't reinventing himself. The world was just finally catching up to who he already was. He beat Vernon White, then got his long-awaited title shot against Randy Couture, a former champion and MMA tactician. Couture had beaten Chuck before. Many believed he'd do it again. He didn't. Chuck knocked him out cold in the first round, and just like that, Chuck Liddell was UFC light heavyweight champion. The world cheered. The cage had a king. After taking the title from Couture, Chuck Liddell entered a different realm, the rarefied air where athletes become icons. This was the golden age of the Iceman. He wasn't just winning, he was ending careers. Jeremy Horn, one of the most experienced fighters alive, got overwhelmed. Chuck chopped him down round by round and finished him with punches in the fourth. Horn had beaten Chuck years earlier. This was revenge. Cold, brutal, final. Then came the rematch with Couture at UFC 57. Another sellout, another massive PPV. Couture was the smarter fighter, the cleaner boxer, but Chuck's right hand didn't care about technique. He knocked Randy out again, emphatically, and the myth grew. He was defending the belt, starring in commercials, appearing in movies, and walking red carpets. Yet somehow, he still felt authentic. He still lived in San Luis Obispo, still trained at the Pit, still had steak and eggs before every fight, still showed up to sparring ready to take someone's head off. He was a blue-collar superstar in a world full of wannabe celebrities. Then came the rematch with Tito Ortiz at UFC 66, a record-breaking event that crossed 1 million pay-per-view buys. It was the biggest fight in MMA MMA history at the time, and Chuck delivered again. He dropped Tito with a straight right, then swarmed him. Fight over. Legacy cemented. He had cleaned out the division, held the belt for over 2 years. Every fight a headline, every walkout a war drum, every stare down a warning. Chuck Liddell was the UFC, but the game was changing. New fighters were coming up, younger, faster, more well-rounded, and Chuck's style, that walk-forward, swing-heavy storm, was starting to show cracks. He didn't care. He said what every aging warrior says, "I can still knock anyone out." And maybe he could, but the world was about to test that theory in the harshest way possible. In May 2007, Chuck Liddell stood across the cage from Quinton "Rampage" Jackson, the same man who had bullied him in Pride 4 years earlier. This was the rematch, the revenge, the one Chuck had circled on his calendar for years. But when the bell rang at UFC 71, Chuck didn't look like the Predator. He looked flat. Rampage didn't wait. Early in the first round, he slipped Chuck's right hand and countered with a thunderous right hook. Liddell hit the mat, out cold. The king was dethroned in 1 minute and 53 seconds. It was shocking. Not just the loss, the finality of it. Chuck didn't just get caught, he got exposed. And suddenly, the invincible aura was gone. He came back against Keith Jardine, a tricky, awkward fighter with an unorthodox style. Chuck looked hesitant, slower, less sharp. He lost a split decision, 2 losses in a row. The whispers started. People blamed distractions. Chuck was partying more, drinking, living the celebrity life. But in Chuck's mind, nothing had changed. Then came a war with Wanderlei Silva, 2 legends trading bombs. Chuck won by decision in one of the greatest fights ever, but the damage was clear. Both men left the cage looking like they'd been in a car crash. And then, the knockout that changed everything. UFC 80's frightening. Dana White, visibly shaken, said he never wanted to see Chuck fight again. But Chuck, he wasn't done. Not in his mind, not even close. Chuck Liddell had built his empire with knockouts. He made his name walking forward, absorbing shots, and delivering that death touch. But now, that style was becoming a curse. After the brutal KO from Rashad Evans, most believed Chuck was finished. Dana White publicly begged him to retire. "He's done," Dana said in interviews. "I love the guy, but I can't let him get hurt anymore." But Chuck didn't want to go. Fighters rarely do, especially ones who've built their identities around being invincible. And so, at UFC 97, against the dangerous Mauricio Shogun Rua, Chuck stepped into the cage again. Same walkout, same icy stare, same belief, different outcome. In the first round, Chuck looked sharper than before. He landed a few clean shots, even stunned Shogun momentarily. The crowd roared, a glimpse of the old Iceman, but that glimpse was short-lived. Near the end of the round, Chuck left his chin hanging in the pocket. Shogun saw it. A clean left hook landed. Chuck dropped. The ref waved it off. Another knockout, another nightmare. That made 3 devastating KO losses in 4 fights. Now it wasn't just whispers. It was panic. The UFC brass, his coaches, even longtime fans, they all said the same thing. "Stop, please. You've done enough. You don't have anything left to prove." So finally, in December 2010, Chuck announced his retirement. It was emotional, sincere. He stood next to Dana White, thanked the fans, and accepted a front office role with the UFC. Ambassador, legend, face of the past. But while Chuck smiled for the cameras, inside he was breaking. The spotlight faded. The training stopped. The routines disappeared. For a man who had lived every day for the next fight, the silence was unbearable. Depression crept in. Drinking worsened. He struggled with purpose. Yes, he had money, fame, legacy, but none of that could replace what the cage gave him: identity. In 2018, 8 years after his last fight, Chuck Liddell made a shocking announcement. He was returning to fight Tito Ortiz. Again, not in the UFC, but under Oscar De La Hoya's short-lived MMA promotion, Golden Boy. The MMA world was stunned, and not in a good way. Chuck was 48 years old. He hadn't fought in almost a decade. He'd been knocked out cold multiple times before retiring. His speech had slowed, his reflexes dulled. But there he was, grinning at a press conference, claiming he was better than ever. Tito Ortiz? He smelled blood. For years, Chuck had haunted him. 2 brutal losses. But now, Tito saw his chance for revenge and a payday. The fight was set. It wasn't just a bad idea. It felt like a tragedy waiting to happen. Chuck trained hard, tried to recapture the magic, but the signs were everywhere. His movement was stiff, his hands slower. His body no longer responded like it used to. Still, he believed he had to. Warriors don't quit. They just go until someone stops them. Fight night, November 24th, 2018. Chuck looked like a relic. His walkout was surreal, not chilling. The stare was there, but the fire was gone. First round, Tito circled. Chuck barely threw. Then, midway through the round, Tito landed a right hand. Chuck collapsed. Limpio, out cold, again. The crowd didn't cheer. They winced. Commentators went quiet. Fans online called it what it was. Sad, dangerous, irresponsible. It wasn't a fight. It was a eulogy. Tito celebrated like he'd slain a dragon, but most people saw it for what it was. A final, unnecessary blow to a once great legacy. Chuck disappeared again, quietly. No interviews, no more comebacks, just silence. After that final loss to Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell's chapter as a fighter was over. Not with a standing ovation, not with redemption, but with a knockout that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. There was no official retirement speech, no press tour, just a quiet fade into the background. A man who once defined violence now walked into anonymity. Chuck tried to adjust. He made a few podcast appearances, did some small acting roles, signed autographs at conventions, but something was missing. The Iceman persona didn't work without the cage, and Chuck, stripped of that identity, seemed like a man stuck between eras. Too old to compete, too proud to coach, too famous to disappear. Rumors swirled, drinking, isolation, memory issues. Friends said he was struggling. He didn't show it publicly, but those close to him knew. Chuck had poured everything into fighting, and now the engine was off. His relationship with the UFC was strained. Dana White, once his closest ally, distanced himself after the comeback fight. Chuck's front office role was dissolved. The calls stopped coming. Time moved on. John Jones, Daniel Cormier, Israel Adesanya, new champions emerged. New fans entered the sport with no idea who Chuck Liddell even was. Just a name on a highlight reel, a mohawk in 240p footage. And yet, for those who were there, who felt the roar of the crowd when Chuck walked out, who saw him sleep legends with a single punch, they knew Chuck Liddell wasn't just another fighter. He was the foundation. He bled so the sport could live. He sacrificed his body, his mind, and ultimately his peace. And while he may never reclaim the spotlight, his impact remains. In every sold-out arena, every screaming fan, every dollar this sport now generates. Chuck Liddell may never fight again, but the fight never really left him. In recent years, he's started to reappear, slowly, humbly. Not as the Iceman with the death stare and the knockout fists, but as Chuck, a father, a husband, a man still piecing together life after war. He's been seen at events, supporting young fighters, smiling for photos, sometimes even cracking jokes about the wild days. But if you look closely, behind the sunglasses, behind the grin, there's something deeper. A man reckoning with his past. He doesn't talk much about the knockouts, or the comeback, or the nights he can't remember. He speaks carefully, selectively. But when he does open up, it's clear. Chuck knows the cost of being a legend. In interviews, he's admitted to memory lapses, difficulty sleeping, mood swings. The kind of symptoms you hear from every old-school warrior who took too many hits in the era before fighter safety became a conversation. And yet, Chuck never complains. He owns every scar, because in his mind, it was worth it. He came from nothing, fought in empty arenas, took punches for a sport that didn't yet exist, and when the time came to carry it on his back, he did, with fists and fury. Today's fighters make millions. They get health care, sponsorships, legacy security. That wasn't the world Chuck walked into. He helped build that world, and he paid for it. He doesn't chase the spotlight anymore. He doesn't try to be the old Iceman. He lets the new era have its moment, but his shadow still looms. Every time a fighter stands and bangs, every time a walk-off KO goes viral, every time a mohawk shows up on a main card, that's Chuck. And maybe that's the final chapter. Not a comeback, not another fight, but peace, presence, legacy. Not just as a brawler, but as a pioneer. Chuck Liddell didn't fade because he was forgotten. He faded because he finished the mission. And for the ones who were there, who saw the stare, who felt the thunder of his fists, who watched the Iceman melt legends, he'll never really be gone. Legends don't disappear. They just become part of the canvas they helped create.